Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for our word. This morning, as we continue through the scriptures, we're going to be looking at Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, the nation of Israel is camped on the wilderness side of the Jordan River, looking over at the Promised Land. The events of Deuteronomy coincide with the events at the end of the book of Numbers, and really what it is it's a collection of sermons that Moses is delivering to the younger generation that's about to go into the Promised Land to conquer the enemy and claim it for God's glory. In this book and in these sermons, he reminds them of God's holiness. He reminds them of God's law. He is encouraging them and preparing them for the battles that they're going to face ahead. And in chapter 1, as he begins this series of sermons, he reminds the nation of Israel of three very important things as they go to conquer the land. The first thing that Moses reminds them of is to remember to be obedient to God. Look what he says in verses 2 and 3. There are 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spake unto the children of Israel, according to all the Lord had given him in the commandment unto them, after he had slain Sihon, the king of the Amorites, which dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, which dwelt at Asheroth of Edrei. The Bible tells us here that this is 40 years after the judgment of God on the older generation because of their doubt and disobedience to God the first time they came to this location. Now remember, God is speaking to the younger generation. Everyone in the older generation, except for Caleb and Joshua, have died in the wilderness and have been forbidden to enter the Promised Land. The generation that God freed from slavery, the generation that God led through the Red Sea and destroyed the nation of Egypt and fed in the wilderness with manna from heaven and provided water in the wilderness through a rock, and the generation God had done so much work for, had disobeyed God, had been unfaithful to God, had not trusted God, and so God had condemned them from never seeing the Promised Land. Moses didn't want the same for this generation, so he's reminding them and encouraging them to be obedient to God, to trust God, to be faithful to God, because the punishment or the judgment for disobedience and sin is always death. And he didn't want this younger generation to suffer the same fate that the older generation had. But then he also reminds them of something else. He reminds them to remember their old victories as they're facing new battles. Again, look at verse number 4. And he had slain Sihon, the king of the Amorites, which dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, which dwelt at Asheroth of Edrei. Moses knows that they're facing some pretty incredible battles ahead of them. The Promised Land is filled with Canaanite armies and walled cities and very difficult enemies to defeat. You know, remember when the 12 spies went into Israel and came back, 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, talked about the power of God and the ability of God, but 10 of them talked about the power of the enemy and the size of the enemy. The enemy hasn't shrunk. They've gotten bigger, they've gotten better, they've gotten stronger. And Israel is facing some very tough battles ahead of them, but Moses reminds them that they've already faced some pretty tough battles, that they've already had some incredible victories. And the armies they faced in the wilderness were too big for them to beat, but they beat them anyway because they had God fighting for them. The enemies they're going to face in the Promised Land, they're impossible to beat, but they still have God fighting for them. So he says, remember, when you're facing troubles ahead and you're facing trials ahead and you're facing battles ahead, remember how God has delivered you in the past. And that leads us to the third thing that Moses reminds them of. He reminds them that God is always with them. Look what he says in verse number 30. The Lord your God, which goeth before you, he shall fight for you, according to all that he did for you in Egypt before your eyes, and in the wilderness where thou hast seen that the Lord thy God bare thee as a man doth bear his son, in all the way that ye went until you came into this place. Yet in this thing ye did not believe the Lord your God. So Moses reminds them, look, when we came out of Egypt, God was with us. When we went through the wilderness, God was with us. When we faced battles, God was with us. When we were hungry, God was with us and took care of us. When we were thirsty, God was with us and took care of us. And God will be with you every day as you enter this new stage of life and enter the Promised Land. See, God had promised Israel And God has promised us that He will never leave us, He will never forsake us. He said, I will always be with you. It's easy to forget that God's with you when we're in the wilderness, when we're facing troubles and trials and difficult situations. But we need to remember that no matter what we're facing, no matter what we're going through, God is always with us. God is always fighting for us, and God is holy, and we should be obedient and faithful and trust Him. Thanks for joining us for this Word of the Day this morning. Hope to see you tomorrow as we're going to continue looking through the book of Deuteronomy. Have a blessed day.